This week's episode of the podcast was recorded on the 8th of June 2022 at home in Wicklow, and it is fundamentally a poetry recital. I decided in my compromised state, you can hear by my voice, I'm not in fine fettle. I decided I didn't have the space in my brain to do one of my normal episodes where I basically freestyle around a couple of themes, and I realised I'd misattributed a poetic reference in last week's episode to Allen Ginsberg, and it should have been attributed to Walt Whitman. And so I went on a bit of a journey around the poetry websites online and corrected or rectified my my knowledge gaps, and it just got me enthusiastic about revisiting some poets that I've known over the years, as a reader, not personally, of course. And I decided to share some of their poems on today's podcast. So you're going to hear a poem from Walt Whitman. You're going to hear Allen Ginsberg's most famous poem of all, and also some poems from Sylvia Plath and another great confessional poet, Anne Sexton. So that's what's coming up. So sit back, relax, and get into a receptive state of mind, because a whole lot of poetry is coming at you. And I'll see you there real soon. Cheers.
Ooh, not gonna change my mind, leaving the dream behind.
Hi, my name is Dara Clear, and you're listening to The Clear Out. Welcome to it. So this is going to be a very challenging episode. It might be challenging for you, the listener, in terms of getting through it. But as you can hear by my voice, I'm still somewhat smothered by a cold, and this has been afflicting me for a couple of weeks now. It's not the dreaded COVID. I did my tests. They were negative, so I'm okay on that front. But I am being brutalized by something on the throat, on the chest, in the sinuses. I may just be about to come good. I felt absolutely rotten this morning, and I thought there's no way in hell I'm going to get the podcast out on time this week. But here I am, my last desperate attempt, and foolishly, in a foolhardy way, I have decided to take on a challenge, and this is going to be a poetry heavy episode. Now this isn't random. This is inspired by me last week's episode, when I was discussing Ray Liotta's career and talking about his style of acting and the type of actor he was compared to Kevin Costner, with whom he appeared in 1989's Field of Dreams. I was sort of saying that I referred to the barbaric Yawp. The barbaric Yawp, which is a quote from an American poet, and I misattributed the quote. The quote of the poet. I misattributed the quote to Allen Ginsberg, and in fact, it comes from a Walt Whitman poem from his epic Leaves of Grass. And so I went digging around today to go, now hold on, how did I get that confused? And I had reminded myself, as soon as I kind of heard my mistake, I was like, I know what I was thinking of. It might have been Walt Whitman's Yawp, but it was most certainly Allen Ginsberg's Howl. And there's a crossover there, and I suppose in many ways those beat poets and confessional poets of the mid 20th century in America were the inheritors of Whitman's own expressive voice and his own honesty and his own exploration and presentation of a highly personalized American voice, even though Whitman was active 100 years earlier. Whitman, in fact, he was around during the American Civil War. He was around for the death of Abraham Lincoln and wrote the famous poetic eulogy for Lincoln, that lovely title, When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed, which is his sort of tribute to the fallen Lincoln after his assassination. So while Whitman was certainly capable of the internal exploration of self and successfully conducted his findings into his poetry, he wasn't a million miles away from a classical poetic voice, and the eulogy to Lincoln sort of backs that up. But if it wasn't for Whitman, maybe we wouldn't have had the likes of Allen Ginsberg. We wouldn't have had the likes of Robert Lowell and others. Maybe Kerouac falls into that bracket as well. And the female. I was curious about who were considered the female kind of confessional poets of the mid 20th century, and the two names that came back most prominently were Sylvia Plath and Anne Sexton. With whose work I would have been more acquainted with poetry of Sylvia Plath's from when I studied literature in college, and I came upon Anne Sexton's work in a different context. I think when I was teaching English in Melbourne, I came across an astonishingly powerful poem of hers called Red Roses, which I might indulge myself and read that. There's a couple of other of her poems I'd like to read also. But anyway, look, what's the bottom line? The bottom line is I've come to this episode this week being determined to indulge my interest in American poetry, and in these distinctive voices. And so I'm planning to recite some of the more famous works by these poets that you've heard me mention. And some of these poems are long, and I'm, even as I sit here, I'm wondering, am I going to have the stamina and the vocal dexterity to take on Ginsberg's Howl, which really became the defining document of the counterculture movement in America. The defining artistic expression of that countercultural voice, coming as it did approximately 15 years after the Second World War, maybe less, maybe 10. And it was a controversial poem. There were attempts to have it banned for being obscene because of its explicit references to sex and to homosexual sex. But it was, thankfully, that case was thrown out by a sensible judge who fundamentally was saying, poetry and the artistic voice can't be restricted to mundane, boring things. I mean, I'm paraphrasing atrociously there, but it was a strong stand to go, all voices and all expressive voices and all artistic voices need to have that scope of freedom of expression. And yeah, so I'll see. I might try and take on Howl, which is enormously long, but I am going to start with something shorter and simpler, and that is Song of Myself 52 by Walt Whitman from his Leaves of Grass. And I believe this is the poem with which he concludes his Leaves of Grass collection, which he worked on through most of his life and updated it. And this is the poem where you'll hear the reference to the barbaric Yawp. The spotted hawk swoops by and accuses me. He complains of my gab and my loitering. I too am not a bit tamed. I too am untranslatable. I sound my barbaric yawp over the roofs of the world. The last scud of day holds back for me. It flings my likeness after the rest, and true as any on the shadowed wilds, it coaxes me to the vapour and the dusk. I depart as air. I shake my white locks at the runaway sun. I effuse my flesh in eddies and drift it in lacy jags. I bequeath myself to the dirt to grow from the grass I love. If you want me again, look for me under your boot soles. You will hardly know who I am or what I mean, but I shall be good health to you nevertheless, and filter and fibre your blood. Failing to fetch me at first, keep encouraged. Missing me one place, search another. I stop somewhere waiting for you. There you go. Thanks, Walt. So that was his parting poem, reflecting on his return to the soil, out of which grass would grow from his remains, and those searching for him would find him underfoot. Very, very sanguine and accepting of his fate. Very realistic. He, I haven't read or studied much of Whitman, but having a look at that poem today, nice imagery, nice language, and sometimes that's all I want from a poem. I don't necessarily need to understand it immediately. I'm happy just to go on the journey and see, and get my head around the language, or get my tongue around the language. And that's something we forget, that poetry, as much as it can be nice to read, really it's something that should be heard. It's something that should be said aloud, for it to be more effective, to be given volume, to be given air, to be sounded in the air. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of jump around a little, and I'm going to come straight over to poor old Sylvia Plath. I shouldn't laugh. I mean, hers was a tragic life, tormented by depression and suicidal tendencies, when she eventually did succeed in taking her own life. And her poetry was very much of the confessional movement, where poets really explored their inner demons and laid them all out on the page for everyone to see, sometimes in very painful ways, in ways that would perhaps make the listener uncomfortable and flinch. They're confronting. And this is one of Plath's most famous poems. It's Daddy. And Sylvia Plath's father died when she was only a little girl. I thought it was when she was 8. Now in this poem she refers to him dying when she was 10. So I'm not sure if I got that wrong. Sylvia Plath famously married to Ted Hughes, who I always think of as the great British naturalist poet, a poet of the natural world. That might be a little bit too reductive. And he was a champion of Plath's work after her death. She died very young. She was only 30 when she ended her own life. But you read some of her poems and you kind of get an insight into her troubled mind, and there's a lot of darkness there. But what we get from her poetry is an undeniable power, and I think that's part of my fascination in this, in what I'm trying to convey in this episode with the poems I'm presenting, is the power of the unencumbered voice, or the unencumbered expression of an encumbered soul. This poetic cry from the heart, and the poetic fearlessness, whether in form and breaking the conventions of poetic form. There's a lot of free verse, non-rhyming, open verses, and a sort of a language of emotional and social and political and personal brutality that is brave and unafraid to be seen, and is a very pure expression of something deep inside the poet, and it comes out in different ways. But Sylvia Plath, the way she used language, it was very unambiguous and fierce. And I think in Daddy, which is sort of her attempt to sever this hold her father has over her, her memory of her father, and how he has loomed large in her consciousness. This is her attempt to go, enough is enough. I don't want you to have this power over me anymore. And there's so much anger and hurt and viciousness, I think, in how she negotiates this attempt at severance via the poem. So here it is. This is Daddy by Sylvia Plath. You do not do. You do not do anymore. Black shoe in which I have lived like a foot for 30 years, poor and white, barely daring to breathe or achoo. Daddy, I have had to kill you. You died before I had time. Marble heavy, a bag full of God. Ghastly statue with one grey toe, big as a Frisco seal, and a head in the freakish Atlantic, where it pours bean green over blue in the waters off beautiful Nauset. I used to pray to recover you, ach du. In the German tongue, in the Polish town, scraped flat by the roller of wars, wars, wars. But the name of the town is common. My Polack friend says there are a dozen or two. So I could never tell where you put your foot, your root. I could never talk to you. The tongue stuck in my jaw. It stuck in a barbed wire snare. Ick, 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 ick. I could hardly speak. I thought every German was you. and the language obscene, an engine chuffing me off like a Jew to Dachau, Auschwitz, Belsen. I began to talk like a Jew. I think I may well be a Jew. The snows of the Tyrol, the clear beer of Vienna are not very pure or true. With my gypsy ancestress and my weird luck and my tarot pack, I may be a bit of a Jew. I have always been scared of you, with your Luftwaffe, your gobbledy-goo, and your neat moustache, and your Aryan eye, bright blue. Panzer man, oh, you! Not God, but a swastika so black no sky could squeak through. Every woman adores a fascist. The boot in the face. The brute heart of a brute like you. You stand at the blackboard, Daddy, in the picture I have of you. A cleft in your chin instead of your foot, but no less a devil for that. No, not any less the black man who bit my pretty red heart in two. I was 10 when they buried you. At 20, I tried to die and get back to you. I thought even the bones would do. But they pulled me out of the sack, and they stuck me together with glue. And then I knew what to do. I made a model of you, a man in black with a Mein Kampf look, and a love of the rack and the screw. And I said, I do. So, Daddy, I'm finally through. The black telephone's off at the root. The voices just can't worm through. If I've killed one man, I've killed two. The vampire who said he was you and drank my blood for a year. 7 years, if you want to know. Daddy, you can lie back now. There's a stake in your fat black heart, and the villagers never liked you. They are dancing and stamping on you. They always knew it was you. Daddy, you bastard. I'm through. I mean, what do you say? What do you say to that? It's, yeah. It is brutal. I mean, God love her, I suppose, is what I think. And yet, she left us that, amongst other poems. But that poem always packs a punch. No matter how many times I've come back to it, there's just something so ferociously hurt and broken-hearted and futile about it. So there's a real, in my opinion, just a tremendous sadness that you can't shake off when you hear that poem. Anyway, Sylvia, let's move on. Excuse me, sorry. The next poet I want to look at is another female poet, because I was trying to, I wanted to sort of go like, what's the difference? What's the difference in the voice? The female confessional voice versus the male confessional voice. And I found myself wondering about the sort of social expectations, the social mores that would have prevailed at the time these poets were writing in the mid 20th century, 1950s, 1960s, and what they would have been up against. Conservatism and traditionalism and sexism. In Ginsberg's case, perhaps anti-Semitism, homophobia, and what different levels of freedom would have been afforded a man as opposed to a woman, what the different concerns would have been of men and women, male and female artists, writers at that time, how they felt impacted by society. And it does seem to me that Plath and Sexton, their poetry and their confessional poetry, it's much of it is very much about the internal experience, their internal landscape and their internal female landscape, and their obsessions with womanhood, femininity, motherhood, sexuality, apart from gender neutral ideas of depression and suicidal ideation. Anne Sexton, I believe, also ended her own life, but maybe she I think she was a model as well as a poet, and she did other things. She may have even been a singer for a while. So some of her poetry has a more overtly sexual energy, actually. And I'm going to read you a few of hers, because I think they're worth hearing, and you can see what you make of them yourself. I referred. Maybe I'll start with that one. The first poem of Anne Sexton's I came across when I was researching the Confessional School, from the mid 20th century, and Robert Lowell is considered, I think, the father of the Confessional School. And I was doing this with some high school students in Melbourne, and I found Red Roses, and I found it really chilling, and I wanted to, I'm going to revisit that one, and you can see what you think. So this is Red Roses by Anne Sexton. Tommy is 3, and when he's bad, his mother dances with him. She puts on the record Red Roses for a Blue Lady and throws him across the room. Mind you, she never laid a hand on him. He gets red roses in different places. The head, that time he was as sleepy as a river. The back, that time he was a broken scarecrow. The arm, like a diamond, had bitten it. The leg, twisted like a licorice stick. All the dance they did together, Blue Lady and Tommy. You fell, she said. Just remember, you fell. I fell, is all he told the doctors in the big hospital. A nice lady came and asked him questions, but because he didn't want to be sent away, he said, I fell. He never said anything else, although he could talk fine. He never told about the music, or how she'd sing and shout, holding him up and throwing him. He pretends he is her ball. He tries to fold up and bounce, but he squashes like fruit. For he loves Blue Lady and the spots of red roses he gives her. Yeah, so I don't know what makes that such a haunting poem. The victimization of little Tommy, the manipulation of Tommy, convincing him to lie, the deceptive metaphor. We see that title, Red Roses, and many of us, conditioned to such things, assume it's going to be something nice, a love poem perhaps, and instead we get a picture of of a mother who's out of control, of a mother who throws her son around the place, and of the son's dedication to saving his mother and keeping her safe from persecution. Strong stuff. Let me give you another one of hers that isn't quite so grim. This one I like. This is called Barefoot. Loving me with my shoes off means loving my long brown legs, sweet dears, as good as spoons, and my feet, those two children let out to play naked, intricate nubs, my toes, no longer bound. And what's more, see toenails, and all 10 stages, root by root, all spirited and wild. This little piggy went to market, and this little piggy stayed. Long brown legs and long brown toes. Further up, my darling, the woman is calling her secrets, little houses, little tongues that tell you. There is no one else but us in this house on the land spit. The sea wears a bell in its navel, and I'm your barefoot wench for a whole week. Do you care for salami? No. You'd rather not have a scotch? No. You don't really drink. You do drink me. The gulls kill fish, crying out like 3-year-olds. The surf's a narcotic, calling out, I am, I am, I am, all night long. Barefoot, I drum up and down your back. In the morning, I run from door to door of the cabin playing Chase Me. Now you grab me by the ankles. Now you work your way up the legs and come to pierce me at my hunger mark. So yeah, a poem of a very different vibe and feeling, and more adult focused and sex focused, but again evocative, atmospheric, really, yeah, has a nice little punch all of its own. I'm gonna give you one more of hers, because I think this one is also very nice. Just my opinion, of course. This one is called 45 Mercy Street, a fragment, and apparently this inspired, or in some way inspired, Peter Gabriel's song Mercy Street. So you can go and do a bit of your own digging for that if you want to find out more there. So yeah, here we go. 45 Mercy Street, a fragment by Anne Sexton. In my dream, drilling into the marrow of my entire bone, my real dream, I'm walking up and down Beacon Hill, searching for a street sign, namely Mercy Street. Not there. I try the Back Bay. Not there. Not there. And yet I know the number. 45 Mercy Street. I know the stained glass window of the foyer, the 3 flights of the house with its parquet floors. I know the furniture and mother, grandmother, great-grandmother, the servants. I know the cupboard of Spode, the boat of ice, solid silver, where the butter sits in neat squares like strange giants' teeth on the big mahogany table. I know it well. Not there. Where did you go? 45 Mercy Street, with great-grandmother kneeling in her whalebone corset and praying gently but fiercely to the wash basin at 5 a.m, at noon dozing in her wicky rocker, grandfather taking a nap in the pantry, grandmother pushing the bell for the downstairs maid, and Nana rocking mother with an oversized flower on her forehead to cover the curl of when she was good and when she was, and where she was begat, and in a generation, the 3rd, she will beget me, with the stranger's seed blooming into the flower called horrid. I walk in a yellow dress and a white pocketbook stuffed with cigarettes, enough pills, my wallet, my keys, and being 28, or is it 45? I walk. I hold matches at street signs, for it is dark as the leathery dead, and I have lost my green Ford, my house in the suburbs, 2 little kids sucked up like pollen by the bee in me, and a husband who has wiped off his eyes in order not to see my inside out. And I am walking and looking, and this is no dream, just my oily life, where the people are alibis, and the street is unfindable for an entire lifetime. Pull the shades down, I don't care. Bolt the door, Mercy. Erase the number. Rip down the street sign. What can it matter? What can it matter to this cheapskate who wants to own the past that went out on a dead ship and left me only with paper? Not there. I open my pocketbook as women do, and fish swim back and forth between the dollars and the lipstick. I pick them out one by one and throw them at the street signs and shoot my pocketbook into the Charles River. Next, I pull the dream off and slam into the cement wall of the clumsy calendar I live in, my life, and its hauled up notebooks. Okay, Anne Sexton, pretty interesting, no? Again, I like the imagery, I like the rhythm, I like the momentum, I like there's notes of defiance, there's notes of anger, there's notes of yearning, there's notes of looking back, there's notes of shame. I mean, this is why it's called the Confessional School. They're deeply, deeply personal expressions of self. And yeah, all the more powerful for it. Okay, so now it's now it's time for the foolhardy. perhaps, we shall see, attempt at reading Allen Ginsberg's Howl. I know my good friend and a friend of the podcast, Shane, in San Francisco. He and I studied together way back when, fellow English literature students, and he got turned on by Ginsberg early on. He Ginsberg, not he, my friend Shane. Thanks for listening, Shane. I know you're out there. He occupied a particular place as this figure of rebellion, and this figure of experimentation, and this figure of fearlessness and defiance, and probably nothing more than Howl typifies this. And it's divided into 3 parts, this long poem, which I saw one commenter dismiss as claptrap. Excuse me. But others who hold it up and sanctify it as a hallowed artifact of great American poetry, defining American poetry. The first part of the poem is Ginsberg's sort of roll call of figures who he identifies with and celebrates. We're talking about rebels and revolutionaries and poets from all around America, and communists and people of the street and people of the night and people on the outside and people who have been oppressed and repressed, and toilet traders and sex workers, and it's just a this kind of modernist almost stream of consciousness flow of a parade of colourful outcast figures with whom Ginsberg clearly identifies with and wants to celebrate and protect and make seen in his verse. That's the first part. The second part is his howl of derision, his howl of despair at the rise of capitalism and the industrial capitalist machine. And he names it as Moloch, who was a child-devouring figure of Jewish myth, unless I'm mistaken. So that verse is full of exclaimed outcries of disgust, and Moloch's name is taken many, many, many times. And finally, he addresses in his third section his friend or acquaintance or fellow struggler, fellow rebel, fellow artist, fellow writer, Carl Solomon. And it's the poem Howl is dedicated to Carl Solomon. So wherever you see it, it's for Carl Solomon. Carl Solomon is a writer who Ginsberg met at a psychiatric institution, or in the waiting room of a psychiatric institution, and he uses the name Rockland in the final verse to name that institution, but it's a made-up name, and apparently Carl Solomon was quite resistant to the appropriation of his story for the sake of Ginsberg's opus. But there you go. It's still it's still gone down as great art. So I'm going to begin this attempt, and I'll see. I may have to stop at times to try and clear my head physically, so I can maintain a reasonable voice, even though I know I sound a bit foghorny. I'm very horny tonight. I'm foghorny. Okay, this is, I hope it's going to be, this is Howl by Allen Ginsberg. This is from, I'm going to kill myself for not noting when it was written. 1955, so it's probably written a couple of years before that, but first recited, I think, October 1955. And there was I saw a great quote from people who attended, from one of the people who attended, Michael McClure. And in this, I'm quoting this. I lifted this off Wikipedia. Okay, again, not extensive research here, but McClure said, in response to Ginsberg's reading, McClure wrote, Ginsberg read on to the end of the poem, which left us standing in wonder, or cheering and wondering, but knowing at the deepest level that a barrier had been broken, that a human voice and body had been hurled against the harsh wall of America. Fantastic. I love that. So that's just to give you an idea of the significance of the poem and its impact when Ginsberg first made it public. So here we go. Bear with it. Go on the journey. See where it takes you. Part 1. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked, dragging themselves through the Negro streets at dawn looking for an angry fix, angel-headed hipsters burning for the ancient heavenly connection to the starry dynamo in the machinery of night, who poverty and tatters and hollow-eyed and high sat up smoking in the supernatural darkness of cold water flats floating across the tops of cities contemplating jazz, who bared their brains to heaven under the L and saw Mohammedan angels staggering on tenement roofs illuminated, who passed through universities with radiant, cool eyes hallucinating Arkansas and Blake Light tragedy among the scholars of war, who were expelled from the academies for crazy and publishing obscene odes on the windows of the skull, who cowered in unshaven rooms in underwear, burning their money in wastebaskets and listening to the terror through the wall, who got busted in their pubic beards returning through Laredo with a belt of marijuana for New York, who ate fire in paint hotels or drank turpentine in Paradise Alley, death, or purgatoried their torsos night after night, with dreams, with drugs, with waking nightmares, alcohol and cock and endless balls, incomparable blind streets of shuddering cloud and lightning in the mind, leaping toward poles of Canada and Patterson, illuminating all the motionless world of time between, peyote solidities of halls, backyard green tree cemetery dawns, wine drunkenness over the rooftops, storefront boroughs of tea-head joyride neon blinking traffic light, sun and moon and tree vibrations in the roaring winter dusks of Brooklyn, ashcan rantings and kind king light of mind, who changed themselves to subways for the endless ride from Battery to Holy Bronx on Benzedrine until the noise of wheels and children brought them down, shuddering, mouth racked and battered, bleak of brain, all drained of brilliance in the drear light of zoo, who sank all night in submarine light of Bickfords floated out and sat through the stale beer afternoon in desolate fugazis, listening to the crack of doom on the hydrogen jukebox, who talked continuously 70 hours from park to pad to bar to Bellevue to museum to the Brooklyn Bridge. A lost battalion of platonic conversationalists jumping down the stoops, off fire escapes, off windowsills, off Empire State, out of the moon. yakety-yakking, screaming, vomiting, whispering facts and memories and anecdotes and eyeball kicks and shocks of hospital and jails and wars, whose intellects disgorged in total recall for 7 days and nights with brilliant eyes, meet for the synagogue cast on the pavement, who vanished into nowhere, Zen, New Jersey, leaving a trail of ambiguous picture postcards of Atlantic City Hall, suffering eastern sweats and Tangerian bone grindings and migraines of China under junk withdrawal in Newark's bleak furnished room, who wandered around and around at midnight in the railroad yard, wondering where to go, and went, leaving no broken hearts, who lit cigarettes in boxcars, racketing through snow toward lonesome farms in grandfather night, who studied Plotinus, Poe, St. John of the Cross, telepathy, and Bop Kabbalah because the cosmos instinctively vibrated at their feet in Kansas, who loaned it through the streets of Idaho, seeking visionary Indian angels, who were visionary Indian angels, who thought they were only mad when Baltimore gleamed in supernatural ecstasy, who jumped in limousines with the Chinaman of Oklahoma on the impulse of winter, midnight, streetlight, small-town rain, who lounged hungry and lonesome through Houston, seeking jazz or sex or soup, and followed the brilliant Spaniard to converse about America and eternity, a hopeless task, and so took ship to Africa, who disappeared into the volcanoes of Mexico, leaving behind nothing but the shadow of dungarees and the lava and ash of poetry scattered in fireplace Chicago, who reappeared on the West Coast, investigating the FBI in beards and shorts, with big pacifist eyes, sexy in their dark skin, passing out incomprehensible leaflets, who burned cigarette holes in their arms, protesting the narcotic tobacco haze of capitalism, who distributed super-communist pamphlets in Union Square, weeping and undressing while the sirens of Los Alamos wailed them down and wailed down Wall, and the Staten Island ferry also wailed, who broke down crying in white gymnasiums, naked and trembling before the machinery of other skeletons, who bit detectives in the neck and shrieked with delight in police cars for committing no crime but their own wild cooking, pederasty and intoxication, who howled on their knees in the subway and were dragged off the roof, waving genitals and manuscripts, who let themselves be fucked in the ass by saintly motorcyclists and screamed with joy, who blew and were blown by those human seraphim, the sailors, caresses of Atlantic and Caribbean love, who bawled in the morning, in the evenings, in rose gardens and the grass of public parks and cemeteries, scattering their semen freely to whomever come who may, who hiccuped endlessly trying to giggle but wound up with a sob behind a partition in a Turkish bath when the blonde and naked angel came to pierce them with a sword, who lost their love boys to the 3 old shrews of fate, the one-eyed shrew of the heterosexual dollar, the one-eyed shrew that winks out of the womb, and the one-eyed shrew that does nothing but sit on her ass and snip the intellectual golden threads of the craftsman's loom, who copulated ecstatic and insatiate with a bottle of beer, a sweetheart, a package of cigarettes, a candle, and fell off the bed, and continued along the floor and down the hall, and ended fainting on the wall with a vision of ultimate cunt and cum eluding the last jism of consciousness, who sweetened the snatches of 1,000,000 girls trembling in the sunset and were red-eyed in the morning, but prepared to sweeten the snatch of the sunrise, flashing buttocks under barns and naked in the lake, who went out whoring through Colorado in myriad stolen night cars, N.C., secret hero of these poems, coxman and Adonis of Denver, joy to the memory of his innumerable lays of girls in empty lots and diner backyards, movie houses, rickety rows, on mountain tops, in caves, or with gaunt waitresses in familiar roadside lonely petticoat upliftings, and especially secret gas stations, solipsisms of Johns, and hometown alleys too, who faded out in vast, sordid movies, were shifted in dreams, woke on a sudden Manhattan, and picked themselves up out of basements hung over with heartless Tokay horrors of Third Avenue iron dreams, and stumbled to unemployment offices, who walked all night with their shoes full of blood on the snowbank docks, waiting for a door in the East River to open to a room full of steam heat and opium, who created great suicidal dramas on the apartment cliffbanks of the Hudson under the wartime blue floodlight of the moon, and their heads shall be crowned with laurel in oblivion, who ate the lamb stew of the imagination, or digested the crab at the muddy bottom of the rivers of Bowery, who wept at the romance of the streets with their pushcarts full of onions and bad music, who sat in boxes breathing in the darkness under the bridge and rose up to build harpsichords in their lofts, who coughed on the 6th floor of Harlem, crowned with flame under the tubercular sky surrounded by orange crates of theology, who scribbled all night, rocking and rolling over lofty incantations which in the yellow morning were stanzas of gibberish, who cooked rotten animals, lung, heart, feet, tail, borscht and tortillas, dreaming of the pure vegetable kingdom, who plunged themselves under meat trucks looking for an egg, who threw their watches off the roof to cast their ballot for eternity outside of time, and alarm clocks fell on their heads every day for the next decade, who cut their wrists 3 times successively, unsuccessfully, gave up, and were forced to open antique stores where they thought they were growing old, and cried, who were burned alive in their innocent flannel suits on Madison Avenue amid blasts of leaden verse and the tanked up clatter of the iron regiments of fashion, and the nitroglycerine shrieks of the fairies of advertising, and the mustard gas of sinister intelligent editors, or were run down by the drunken taxicabs of absolute reality, who jumped off the Brooklyn Bridge, this actually happened, and walked away unknown and forgotten into the ghostly days of Chinatown soup alleyways and fire trucks, not even one free beer, who sang out of their windows in despair, fell out of the subway window, jumped in the filthy Passaic, leaped on Negroes, cried all over the street, danced on broken wine glasses barefoot, smashed phonograph records of nostalgic European 1930s German jazz, finished the whiskey and threw up groaning into the bloody toilet, moans in their ears and the blast of colossal steam whistles, who barreled down the highways of the past, journeying to each other's hot rod Golgotha jail solitude watch or Birmingham jazz incarnation, who drove cross-country 72 hours to find out if I had a vision, or you had a vision, or he had a vision to find out eternity, who journeyed to Denver, who died in Denver, who came back to Denver and waited in vain, who watched over Denver and brooded and loaned in Denver, and finally went away to find out the time, and now Denver is lonesome for her heroes, who fell on their knees in hopeless cathedrals, praying for each other's salvation and light and breasts, until the soul illuminated its hair for a second, who crashed through their minds in jail, waiting for impossible criminals with golden heads and the charm of reality in their hearts, who sang sweet blues to Alcatraz, who retired to Mexico to cultivate a habit, or Rocky Mount to tender Buddha, or Tangiers to boys, or Southern Pacific to the black locomotive, or Harvard to Narcissus, to Woodlawn, to the daisy chain, or grave, who demanded sanity trials accusing the radio of hypnotism and were left with their insanity and their hands and a hung jury, who threw potato salad at CCNY lecturers on Dadaism and subsequently presented themselves on the granite steps of the madhouse with shaven heads and harlequin speech of suicide demanding instantaneous lobotomy, and who were given instead the concrete void of insulin, metrazole, electricity, hydrotherapy, psychotherapy, occupational therapy, ping-pong and amnesia, who in humourless protest overturned only one symbolic ping-pong table, resting briefly in catatonia, returning years later truly bald except for a wig of blood and tears and fingers to the visible madman doom of the wards of the mad towns of the East, pilgrim states, rocklands, and greystones fetid halls, bickering with the echoes of the soul, rocking and rolling in the midnight solitude bench dolmen realms of love, dream of life and nightmare, bodies turned to stone as heavy as the moon, with mother finally, and the last fantastic book flung out of the tenement window, and the last door closed at 4 a.m., and the last telephone slammed at the wall in reply, and the last furnished room emptied down to the last piece of mental furniture, a yellow paper rose twisted on a wire hanger in the closet, and even that imaginary, nothing but a hopeful little bit of hallucination. Ah, Carl, while you are not safe, I am not safe, and now you're really in the total animal soup of time. And who, therefore, ran through the icy streets, obsessed with a sudden flash of the alchemy of the use of the ellipsis catalogue, a variable measure and the vibrating plane, who dreamt and made incarnate gaps in time and space through images juxtaposed, and trapped the archangel of the soul between two visual images, and joined the elemental verbs and set the noun and dash of consciousness together, jumping with sensation of pater omnipotens aeterna deus, to recreate the syntax and measure of poor human prose, and stand before you speechless and intelligent and shaking with shame, rejected yet confessing out the soul to conform to the rhythm of thought in his naked and endless head. The madman bum and angel beat in time, unknown, yet putting down here what might be left to say in time come after death. And rose reincarnate in the ghostly clothes of jazz, in the gold-horned shadow of the band, and blew the suffering of America's naked mind for love into an Eli, Eli, Lama, Lama, Sabachthani saxophone cry that shivered the cities down to the last radio with the absolute heart of the poem of life, butchered out of their own bodies, good to eat 1,000 years. Part 2. What sphinx of cement and aluminum bashed open their skulls and ate up their brains and imagination? Moloch, solitude, filth, ugliness, ash cans and unobtainable dollars, children screaming under the stairways, boys sobbing in armies, old men weeping in the parks. Moloch, Moloch, nightmare of Moloch, Moloch the loveless, mental Moloch, Moloch the heavy judger of men, Moloch the incomprehensible prison, Moloch the crossbones soulless jailhouse and congress of sorrows, Moloch whose buildings are judgment, Moloch, the vast stone of war, Moloch, the stunned governments, Moloch, whose mind is pure machinery, Moloch, whose blood is running money, Moloch, whose fingers are 10 armies, Moloch, whose breast is a cannibal dynamo, Moloch, whose ear is a smoking tomb, Moloch, whose eyes are 1,000 blind windows, Moloch, whose skyscrapers stand in the long streets like endless Jehovahs, Moloch, whose factories dream and croak in the fog. Moloch, whose smokestacks and antennae crown the cities. Moloch, whose love is endless oil and stone. Moloch, whose soul is electricity and banks. Moloch, whose poverty is the spectre of genius. Moloch, whose fate is a cloud of sexless hydrogen. Moloch, whose name is the mind. Moloch, in whom I sit lonely. Moloch, in whom I dream angels. Crazy in Moloch, cocksucker in Moloch, lack love and madness in Moloch. Moloch, who entered my soul early. Moloch, in whom I am a consciousness without a body. Moloch, who frightened me out of my natural ecstasy. Moloch, whom I abandon. Wake up in Moloch, light streaming out of the sky. Moloch, Moloch, robot apartments, invisible suburbs, skeleton treasuries, blind capitals, demonic industries, spectral nations, invisible madhouses, granite cocks, monstrous bombs. They broke their backs, lifting Moloch to heaven. Pavements, trees, radios, tons, lifting the city to heaven, which exists and is everywhere about us. Visions, omens, hallucinations, miracles, ecstasies, gone down the American river. Dreams, adorations, illuminations, religions, the whole boatload of sensitive bullshit. Breakthroughs, over the river, flips and crucifixions, gone down the flood, highs, epiphanies, despairs, 10 years, animal screams and suicides, minds, new loves, mad generation, down on the rocks of time. Real, holy laughter in the river. They saw it all. The wild eyes, the holy yells. They bade farewell. They jumped off the roof to solitude, waving, carrying flowers, down to the river, into the street. Part 3. Carl Solomon. I'm with you in Rockland, where you're madder than I am. I'm with you in Rockland, where you must feel very strange. I'm with you in Rockland, where you imitate the shade of my mother. I'm with you in Rockland, where you've murdered your 12 secretaries. I'm with you in Rockland, where you laugh at this invisible humour. I'm with you in Rockland, where we are great writers on the same dreadful typewriter. I'm with you in Rockland, where your condition has become serious and is reported on the radio. I'm with you in Rockland, where the faculties of the skull no longer admit the worms of the senses. I'm with you in Rockland, where you drink the tea of the breasts of the spinsters of Utica. I'm with you in Rockland, where you pun on the bodies of your nurses, the harpies of the Bronx. I'm with you in Rockland, where you scream in a straitjacket that you're losing the game of the actual ping-pong of the abyss. I'm with you in Rockland, where you bang on the catatonic piano, the soul is innocent and immortal, it should never die ungodly in an armed madhouse. I'm with you in Rockland, where 50 more shocks will never return your soul to its body again from its pilgrimage to a cross in the void. I'm with you in Rockland, where you accuse your doctors of insanity and plot the Hebrew socialist revolution against the fascist national Golgotha. I'm with you in Rockland, where you will split the heavens of Long Island and resurrect your living human Jesus from the superhuman tomb. I'm with you in Rockland, where there are 25,000 mad comrades all together singing the final stanzas of the Internationale. I'm with you in Rockland, where we hug and kiss the United States under our bed sheets, the United States that coughs all night and won't let us sleep. I'm with you in Rockland, where we wake up electrified out of the coma by our own souls, airplanes roaring over the roof. They've come to drop angelic bombs. The hospital illuminates itself. Imaginary walls collapse. Oh, skinny legions run outside. Oh, starry spangled shock of mercy, the eternal war is here. Oh, victory, forget your underwear, we're free. I'm with you in Rockland. In my dreams, you walk dripping from a sea journey on the highway across America in tears to the door of my cottage in the western night. We made it. Well now, Allen Ginsberg, what do you say to that? You imagine hearing that in 1955 for the first time, as the first drops of a consciousness of social rebellion are beginning to work their way into your soul, into your brain, into your very being, and you sense a need for change, and you're craving a voice, craving hearing something that speaks to you, hearing something different, something that is a counter song to compliance, a counter song to blind acceptance, a counter song to conspiracies of silence and blind spots and denial and repression. And you hear that, it must have been absolutely mind-blowing. And there's a power, again, like there's a power there's a power in the language, and there's a relentlessness. The momentum of the poem. I mean, I read that pretty much blind. I stumbled over one or two words here and there, but yeah, I mean, I just kind of read what was on the page, and sometimes that's enough if the language is there, and I didn't try to think it through. That's a lot of text. Anyway, listen, that's it. That's all I've got for you this week. I was nearly going to be extremely indulgent and throw in one of my own confessional poems, but I don't want to sully the greatness of what I've read here on this episode. Another time perhaps. It'll be too much of an insult, because those poems, everything I've just read, they're all poems of extraordinary power, and all poems of distinctive voices that are, hugely resonant. Beautiful, profound, poetic cries from the heart. And aren't we lucky? Aren't we lucky to have eyes to see, and a brain and ears to receive that language, a brain to concoct the imagery that the language conveys so vividly. So look, I hope you enjoyed it. It was it was as anticipated. It was a bit of a challenge, but I didn't really have the brain capacity this week, having been really sick really for the last couple of weeks. I just didn't have the brain capacity to freestyle the way I normally do, and there was an opportunity to go on a bit of a poetic journey. So a nice alternative to the movie focus of last week's episode, and maybe a reminder that poetry is another vehicle of wellness. Reading poetry, listening to poetry, it invites us into the present and stimulates other parts of ourselves that aren't necessarily triggered or stimulated by other media, like movies or books or music or whatever. But Ginsberg really was. He was the man. I think I heard at some point in the last year or so, I listened to an interview with Patti Smith, probably on Mark Maron, who I referred to last week on his podcast, WTF. And she told a very funny story about, I mean, there was only really one way to interpret it, but fundamentally, Ginsberg treated her to lunch because he thought she was a very attractive young man, and he was sounding her out for a potential seduction, which is kind of brilliant. So she's very self-deprecating in how she relays that story. You can find that on Mark Maron's show. And you just do a YouTube search and you bring up lots of interesting Ginsberg collaborations. There's one there with Bob Dylan. Of course, another great counterculture figure and a New York 60s figure, amongst other things. That's probably from back in the day. It looks older. But then there was one from close to the end of Ginsberg's life I stumbled across, which is Allen Ginsberg and Paul McCartney playing a ballad of American skeletons. And Paul McCartney's there playing his guitar and sort of just improvising along. Musical support, while Ginsberg, probably only a couple of years before he died, I think he died in 97, and this was 95, I think, in Albert Hall in London, and Ginsberg is reading a ballad of American skeletons, and I couldn't remember. It reminded me, there's a song I know which is a very similar feel, and I don't know who recorded it, unless it was the same bloody thing and someone else did a version of it. Anyway, whatever. You can seek that out. That's worth having a look at. There you go. So last week I forgot to include in the description my friend's website for his travel mandalas, and I'll rectify that this week. That's my friend Sean and his wonderful artwork on travelmandalas.com. So I'll put that link in the description this week. Again, Ginsberg, you can find him reciting Howl himself with that very particular, it's quite a 60s cadence. That cadence of protest is what I think of, although it would have been mid-50s. So there, I just got that one wrong as well. Okay, you can find me as always on social media. The Clear Out Podcast is on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, The Clear Out 2 on Twitter, and you can email me anytime you want at theclearoutlive@gmail.com. You can use the supporter link if you want to throw a one-off contribution to the podcast, which will be there wherever you're listening to the podcast, or else you can become a regular patron of the podcast, this independent product, and fire a couple of quid my way every couple of weeks or so, like give me a little cup of tea. So there's a Patreon link there as well in the description, patreon.com/theclearout. Right, I will leave you right there. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed the deluge of poetry from some great American poets. I will see you next week, and hopefully my voice and nose and head and sinuses will be back to normal. Okay, take it easy, mind yourselves, all the best, bye.